Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be a little bit more personal.
So we've been living in Japan and working for over 8 months now. We first came to Japan after I finished my master's degree in Australia because we decided that before we settled down with full-time work, family, all of that, we wanted to experience another culture and another language.
So today we'll be sharing with you our top 5 lessons that we learnt while specifically living in Japan. Some of these might resonate with you if you have lived in another country.
Or if you're ever thinking about moving to Japan in the future, this might be interesting for you.
The first and probably the most important lesson that we've learnt from living in Japan is that learning a new language is extremely difficult and at sometimes quite humbling. Before moving to Japan, the only countries we've traveled to is English-speaking countries such as America and Canada. And the only troubles we had there with the language was figuring out whether to use the word thongs or flip-flops. So you could definitely say that we took for granted how easy it was to book hotels or ask about car insurance. But that's not to say that we actually don't use any English in Japan. There's plenty of English speakers, particularly in the city. And Japan does a great job of making sure that there's plenty of signs that are also in English. However, we've definitely gotten used to and are completely fine with the fact that whenever we order a meal or we're receiving some kind of help with a service, that we kind of actually don't really understand what we're going to be receiving. Essentially, we've come to realize that people living in another country are doing their absolute best to learn the language and also just live their everyday life. And because of living in Japan, we've kind of discovered how easy it can be to find a circle of foreigners, of people who just speak your native language, and just stay within that circle because it's just comfortable. So we live in a share house, which is half Japanese and half foreigners. And whilst it's great that we get to practice our Japanese with the people living here, for better or worse, it's really easy to come home from work at the end of the day and just end up speaking English. So basically, coming from a country like Australia, where there is a large population of immigrants, it's incredibly humbling to move to Japan and have a similar experience where it's so difficult to just speak the native language.
The second lesson that we have learnt from living in Japan is that we're a lot more direct than the average Japanese person. Now, I'm not going to talk about being direct or indirect when you're communicating and say that one is better than the other, because of course this will depend on your culture and your individual personality. But in general, and I do just want to point out this is a generalization, usually Australians are fairly direct when they're talking to someone. They will tell you up front what they're thinking. This is not to say that Australians are uncaring or they just say whatever they want, but generally when you're talking with one, you know where they stand and what they're thinking. And this is perhaps the same with other countries like America or Canada. Now, in saying all this, I'm Australian and I hate confrontation. If confrontation comes along and is like, hello, I'm like, bye-bye. This is probably something I need to work on. But because of this, living in Japan is kind of comfortable for me because there's generally no face-to-face confrontation or people are a lot more indirect. A good example of this indirectness that you may have heard of before is when you call up to make a booking for a particular night at a Japanese hotel. If they're full for that night, they may not necessarily tell you that. Instead, they may just say, oh, you should call back again later. So like I said before, different people will prefer this directness or indirectness depending on your personality and where you're from. Basically, just the life lesson from this point is that we have come to know more about ourselves and how we like being direct, and then also just how other people will operate in different situations. The third thing that living in Japan has taught us is actually closely linked with what I was just talking about. So people in Japan are generally more indirect, and this usually comes from this strong phenomenon in Japan of caring about what other people think and not wanting to inconvenience others. Now again, worrying about others and what they think can have both its good and bad sides, and it can go too far in either direction. Personally, for me, the lesson that I have learned from this is just that I am a little bit more conscious of how my actions impact others. So for example, people who know me well, or people who don't even know me that well, would know that I love to talk. I never shut up, and I can be super loud sometimes. Living in Japan has just taught me that when I'm being super loud and talking at 1,000,000 miles per minute, just to be more conscious of how that's impacting others. Do I completely not disturb others now? No, probably not. Will I change who I am and stop talking so much? No, definitely not. But living in Japan has definitely taught me to just be a little bit more conscious of what I'm doing and who it's impacting.
So our fourth point is that you become more critical of the country you're living in and the way that it operates. And you kind of move away from the notion of Australia is the best country in the world or Nihon saiko da. And you move more towards of a notion of, yeah, these countries are great, but there's room for improvement in both. For example, after using the Shinkansen and other high-speed railways throughout Japan for traveling, you kind of start to think to yourself, why doesn't Australia have this? It's so good. It supports people traveling from the cities out to the rural areas, and people get to see more of their own country, especially if they don't have a car. So you really start to think to yourself, why doesn't Australia have this? But on the other side of things, in Japan, if you want to do anything bank related, good lord, you are going to have to go down to the closest bank and fill out so many forms. But in Australia, they make it so easy. Everything's digitized and you can have a bank and manage your bank account online in just a matter of clicks. But these are the kind of big and drastic points. You also begin to notice just even the small things, such as when you're driving around in Japan, they differentiate learner drivers and senior drivers away from other drivers using the whole badge system. And you think to yourself, why doesn't every country do this? It's the best thing ever. So essentially, living in Japan has taught us to see things with wider eyes and see what kind of works and doesn't work for each country.
So the next thing that Japan has taught us is it's actually quite easy to immediately think the worst of others, and it's something that I would prefer not to do. So living in a country where people speak different languages, you don't speak the native language of the country, and there are different cultural customs, it can be easy for different people to think the worst of others immediately. For example, just this morning I was on the train on my way to work, and I was sitting in between two Japanese ladies. One was a little bit older than me, and one was an old woman. Now, the whole time I was sitting there, the old woman was going to town on her nose. She was really blowing it hard because she was obviously sick. And at one stop, the other lady next to me got up and moved and sat somewhere else. Now, immediately, even without me wanting to, I thought, ooh, did she move because I'm a foreigner? And maybe she didn't want to sit next to me. But then I took a step back and I reasonably thought, no, it was probably because of this old lady here who unfortunately is very sick and is blowing her nose a lot. And she probably thought, Rona, so she moved. Basically, living in Japan as a foreigner makes it really easy to judge someone's actions immediately. And this can go both ways. And I've come to realize that it's just not productive and it just makes your life so much easier if you don't do this. If you can relate to any of these points, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're planning to move to a new country in the future, let us know where and what you're most excited for. We really hope that you've enjoyed this little bit more personal video that we've put out. If you did, please make sure to like it and give it a subscribe.
Do the big heckin' subscribe.
Ah!